I'd like to talk about building community toolboxes, specifically prevention and intervention strategies. And what I'm going to do is share some highlights from the work that Dr. Matson, myself, and our team at the Hadma Project have been engaging in, and that we hope we can explore in more detail in our upcoming, inshallah, with all of your prayers, the Hadma Project Handbook, which will look at the complexities of spiritual abuse and some strategies for preventing and for intervening. So that's what we're going to focus on today. But I want to begin with a reflection on why community toolboxes. When we first began engaging with this topic, the question that kept on coming up in our conversations with one another and with others was that we need an overarching accountability structure. We need something to hold our leaders, both local and national, accountable. And when I was thinking about that, I thought, that may have worked in the 80s, in the 90s, even in the early 2000s, those were my formative years growing up in North America, because there was a sense at that time that we had a single North American Muslim community. It had a big tent kind of feel. And it may be the same in the UK, I'm not sure. But we were brought together annually and even more frequently, conferences, camps, North American programs. And whether the sense of centralization was real or whether it was just a feeling, we were considerably smaller. Well, that can't be denied. We were smaller, and our sources of Islamic knowledge and guidance were much more limited. So by and large, we were learning from our local teachers. We were learning from our local scholars, and a handful, really a handful of North American scholars who themselves were rooted in their own local communities. They were known to the communities, and they were actively engaged in community work. Today, our North American community is significantly larger, more diverse, and religious scholars and teachers are more accessible than ever. We've been talking about this over the last 2 days, right? There are social media, podcasts, other platforms. And as we've been discussing, this has allowed Muslims to remarkably attach themselves to online communities and scholars and teachers that they've never met. They have a sense of affinity, belonging, loyalty even to people who live halfway across the world. And then added to this is something that we've heard about throughout the day so far, is the growth of the celebrity scholar culture. And what we're seeing even in these conferences that actually still happen but are on a much larger scale is that every year there's a new it speaker, or a handful of them. And those are the rooms that are packed. Those are the rooms that there will be lineups of people waiting to get in. And so when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, you could argue that even back in the 90s or the 80s, early 2000s, we lacked a centralized governance structure even then. And so it would have made implementing an accountability structure difficult and unfeasible even then. Our masajid were not all affiliated, so there were still individual masajid throughout North America. However, now the challenge, as I said, is compounded by the fact that religious leaders and teachers are not associated with particular communities or any Muslim physical space. So I've just gone through all of these challenges that keep compounding as our complexity and our numbers grow. But rather than kind of throw up our hands in despair, what we decided to do was to focus on providing, to the extent possible, our local communities with tools to empower them and to build capacity within these communities, focusing not only on leaders, but on congregants as well. And so that's what I want to share this afternoon, is a set of practical tools designed to empower 3 groups of people that we've identified. So the first is care seekers, and these are those who are looking for guidance and Islamic knowledge, no matter how frequent they are in Muslim spaces. And so they are, some people, you could refer to them, and I probably will this afternoon be referring to them as congregants, but these are people who are in pursuit of guidance and knowledge. The second grouping that we identify are the care providers. These are our imams, our chaplains, our youth leaders. What's important to note is that these care providers could be formally trained, but they could also not be formally trained, but they are engaging in this kind of guidance in their communities. And the third is care trustees. And these are our board members, our committee leaders who have a fiduciary duty and are overseeing the day-to-day of their communities. So I want you all, when I'm going to move on and start talking about these tools, but when I'm talking about them, I want you to shift your focus away from almost a parallel universe, which is the online world, and think about your own local communities, because these are the tools that we're hoping to provide to local and larger communities, but we're talking about actual physical spaces, all right? And so I'm going to speak about one prevention tool geared towards care seekers and one meant for care providers, and then I'll turn to the care trustees, and we'll talk about tool 2, and then finally, time permitting, we'll get into the intervention. So the first is care seekers, and that is education and training. And so we need to foster an environment in our communities where spiritual abuse can be understood, it can be named, and it can be discussed in a safe environment. And as with so many taboo topics, education and community awareness is key. And I think it's really important for us not to dismiss this step as not impactful enough, or not good enough, not big enough, not quick enough. And this is something that we learned through working on the Hurma Project podcast, spending 2 years essentially learning ourselves and speaking with experts who could share with us their perspectives and their experience on the many facets of this topic. And those conversations really informed our understanding of the complexities of the topic and then our decisions on what to do next. So taking that time, let's not, sort of belittle it and understand the weight that such awareness training and learning for ourselves can have. So topics for such community trainings could include what are healthy boundaries, how to maintain them in our relationships with religious leadership, understanding the meaning and manifestations of spiritual abuse, how to respond as individuals to disclosures. We heard earlier today, and it was something we learned in our one of the podcast episodes, that family members and friends will be the people that individuals will most readily disclose to. And that means that we will likely have somebody in our life who will come and disclose an incident to us. And so it's important in these trainings to talk about the Rahma response, right? Like how should we respond, or to help us understand how we can respond in a safe manner. Also, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later, is what are the community standards that the community has agreed upon in safeguarding individuals, families, young people, and that should be part of the training as well. The training, of course, should be delivered by somebody with expertise in the area, and one thing that we try to do is to, as you have here today, mental health support's available whenever this kind of training is provided, whether it be online or in person, actually. So you always to have mental health support available. One of the pitfalls of offering this kind of training, and it applies to any kind of training, it applies also to human rights training, and is that it's often one and done. So communities feel that they've offered the training and the responsibility is complete. And so what I'd say to that is that we need to be creative about continuing the conversation and having the conversation be an ongoing one in our communities. Perhaps social media before you offer another in-person training, because we know that that's where our young people are turning. And so, and that means also tapping into the expertise of our young people as well, in terms of creating this content and getting it out, if we want it, in fact, to be impactful. And there's others. For instance, in Canada, imams in December, I believe, dedicate one Friday Jummah sermon or khutbah for disability awareness and rights. And the same has been done with respect to domestic violence. And most recently, given that in Canada we have a federal election coming up next week, that topic was spotlighted throughout the country. And so we could do the same with respect to the issue of spiritual abuse in a proactive manner as opposed to always reacting to an incident, which is what happened in November of last year when the incident happened at Al Maghrib. So we need to get ahead, and we need imams to be addressing this from the minbar. But of course, the issue of that is, what are they going to say? And so that leads us to training for imams themselves. And that's the next category that we want to talk about, and that is care providers. So as a reminder, the category of care providers isn't limited to imams. It can, we're also talking about chaplains, youth leaders, Islamic school teachers, in fact, as well. But my comments today are going to focus specifically on imams and those with an employment relationship with a Muslim organization. So care providers risk causing harm if they don't recognize how and when the boundaries between their multiple relationships, and often those multiple relationships are a reality of their position, especially in small communities. So for instance, their doctor is somebody who may sit in a halaqah with the imam. They may, an Islamic school teacher may have family members in their classroom. So we have, blurred lines essentially, and that's actually part of the nature of our communities. But the responsibility for educating them shouldn't rest specifically on imams. And it's actually, in my view, the responsibility of the boards that are employing them to make sure that they understand professional and healthy boundaries. And that's part of safeguarding the community, including the imam himself. So communities should consider mandating this kind of training, and then it would be refreshed every year. And certainly that would be a improvement from probably the status quo in most communities. But what we learned from our discussions with imams and chaplains on the podcast is that imams require more. They are navigating difficult issues without sufficient mentorship, which is something that was mentioned earlier as well. So communities need to look at helping imams develop those relationships of mentorship. Perhaps in a larger community where there are several centers and mosques, the board could facilitate that kind of mentorship and relationships between imams of different centers. And the imams themselves ought to consider developing networks of mentorship similar to other professions. But what we heard is that it can be a very lonely role, and that the lack of guidance impacts their ability to carry out their very important role in the community in a safe manner and a healthy manner. Mosque boards should also revisit the list of expectations placed on imams and the ways in which that they're being supervised and evaluated. So for instance, as our communities are facing more and more complex issues, imams are being asked to engage in counseling without, being certified or being qualified to provide counseling services. And some will recognize their limitations and push back against that expectation. Other imams will not. And they will, in fact, engage in counseling without the sufficient training or expertise. And so I'll come back to this when we're talking about tools for care trustees. So just hold on to that. Finally, despite limited resources, care providers need to be afforded time for self-care. Our conversations, again, on the podcast taught us that we need to start seeing that connection between boundary violations and being stretched too thin without the ability to spend time with family, without the ability to rest and recharge. And as Dr. Matson indicated earlier, one of the things that we hear is this guilt, that imams are being guilted into doing more and more without being compensated and being told that they're doing it for the sake of Allah. And it's not limited to imams. Many positions, Islamic school principals, teachers, etc., are often being told that by boards. So self-care is something that needs to be intentional and on the radar of the boards that are employing our imams. So let's talk about care trustees. These are the board members, directors, committee leads, etc. I would say that many preventative tools actually can only be implemented and facilitated by the board trustees, because these are the ones that have the responsibility for developing and implementing policies. In the wake of November 2024, the case of the child sexual abuse at Al-Maghrib, several organizations and groups began to ask, what policies can we implement? What policies do we need to protect our children or to prevent such incidences of abuse? And I want to be clear that the policies that I'm going to talk about this afternoon are specifically in relation to adult interactions, because those with respect to child protection require another conversation and another set of expertise. And it's clear that I think the gravity of the situation and the fact that it was a child really shook the community and explains the response that we all witnessed. But one hopes that this is also going to lead to an examination of prevention policies for adult interactions as well. So first, we touched upon the importance of developing policies regarding the appropriate scope of an imam's practice when I talked about counseling. But this policy it's geared towards care providers, but it needs to be taken on by care trustees. The ownership rests with the care trustees. As an example, we assisted a local community in drafting a policy regarding exactly that, counseling services. So what we tried to do in the policy is set out in general terms what is Islamic counseling services, so within the imam's scope of practice, and that would include religious guidance, spiritual support, fatwa, and that may be offered by the imam. So it is considered to be within his scope. But then the policy goes on to describe what is expected of the imam if something comes to him that is outside of the scope. And we indicated that it would be expected that he would consult with a social worker at that point and refer the matter out to external professionals. And the only way that can happen is if the imam is familiar with external supports in the community. And so that is a requirement or an expectation that the imam will do that with the support of a social worker. We also recommended that the policy include a requirement that the imam follow best practices with respect to confidentiality and documentation, again, all with the support of a social worker. These are not straightforward, as we learned. They're not straightforward policies to draft because the line between what is Islamic guidance and counseling and what is more outside of the scope isn't well defined. And so what most communities do is just leave it, and nothing is defined. And then it is usually what happens is that the imam does not want to turn somebody away and engages in the type of counseling that then can lead to harm because it's outside of what they've been trained to do. So this is an example of a policy that can be thought of as a preventative measure that is the responsibility of the board or the care trustees. The other class of policies is that which sets out the expected standard of conduct. So that could be a code of conduct, it could be a harassment and discrimination policy, it could be a respect in the workplace policy, and in fact, some masajid have the legal obligation, depending on your jurisdiction, depending on where you live, if they employ people, they actually have to adopt these kinds of policies. So as an example, the province that we come from, Ontario in Canada, if there is a workplace with 6 or more workers, that's not a lot, 6 or more employees, the workplace legally has to post, not only write, they have to post a written workplace harassment and violence policy. So that would be your imam, a custodian, and a couple of teachers. Okay, so I'm just pointing this out because the boards need to become familiar with the legal obligations that are at play in their jurisdiction. And the congregants, the members, can use this to apply pressure on the leadership to pass these kinds of policies. Because in many cases, it's not voluntary, it's actually legally required. And so what the policies do is define what is considered to be bullying, what is considered to be harassment, but they also affirm, it's kind of reminded me when I was listening to Dr. Mattson this morning, is that we have to define not only what we're against, but what we're for. And so these policies define not only prohibited forms of misconduct, they usually also have statements outlining what is expected, what is the positive affirmations or commitments that the organization is expecting of anybody who occupies their spaces. So it's both the negative and the positive. Now, templates are available for these kinds of policies, and I'm sure you could use an AI software, but that is not what you want to do because we have unique considerations in our own communities. And so we need to turn our mind to the values that we want reflected in these policies. So taking a template from another organization is not advisable. It is something that I would advise other not-profit organizations to do, but not Muslim organizations. I did come across, as an example, a Muslim organization that was rewriting their harassment policy. And so their definition of sexual harassment included unwanted touching, unwanted attention, unwanted staring, even if all of those behaviors were not sexual in nature. So that's very different than the legal definition of sexual harassment, right? Now, the legality of expanding that definition in that way is not the issue, not the point. The point is that when we're drafting these policies, we want to consider our own unique circumstances and our values and needs that we want reflected in our policy. And 2, we want to consult with ideally an HR professional, so a human resources professional or a lawyer in drafting them. But I just want to say that that's something that often kind of halts the process because organizations think that they have to hire a lawyer and then it's going to get very costly when in fact the fact is that HR professionals, which are much more accessible cost-wise, have the expertise to offer. And so yes, you need to consult with a professional, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a legal professional. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the last thing I'll say before moving to intervention is that policies can be useful in shifting our culture. That's ultimately what we want. The policies are not for a binder or for, putting them on the website. We're looking at shifting culture, shifting values, but only if they're transparent, and again, of course, only if they're implemented. And I just want to make a brief comment about the transparency of these policies, because it brings us kind of full circle to my first tool, which was education and training. Because I believe that these policies once they're drafted, need to be part of that training. In one of our first podcast episodes, Dr. Rania Awad shared a piece of very valuable advice that I think of often, that one of her teachers shared with her when she was a teenager studying in Syria. So she was advised to keep her eyes wide open in engaging with and learning from religious teachers, guides, and mentors. And she went on to say that some red flags, and I think we heard this in the previous session as well, that some red flags are felt in the gut, and that they're felt in the heart, and that they should not be ignored. But I want to add to that and say that not all red flags are felt so innately. Some of them are, some of them are not. And so we need to actually teach them, and we need to point them out explicitly through education and through awareness. And so what we're doing is we're educating ourselves about the standards that the community has agreed to through its policies, so that conduct outside of those standards become the red flags that we begin to recognize. So yes, some are felt, but others won't be. So we need to familiarize ourselves and familiarize our youth and our children what to look out for. And that's part of the education, that's part of the awareness. Okay, so let's move to intervention. What happens when an incident of abuse in our community has happened, or when concerns are raised about suspected abuse of power? I'm going to identify two this afternoon. Again, we're going to have time to discuss some of these things at our tables after. So when an incident or alleged incident comes to the attention of the board, they should be able to turn to a policy for guidance on what to do next, or at least a hint on what to do next. And it's worth noting that mosque boards are not alone in not having the policies in place. I think it's really important for us not to always kind of bring ourselves down and think like, oh, we're so behind, we don't have these policies, when in fact so many small charities and not-for-profit organizations are in the same boat for probably many of the same reasons. In any case, so boards need to have a policy and a procedure that lays out a complaint process. It doesn't need to be its own policy. It could live within the harassment policy. Regardless of where it is, the clarity of a complaints process is key, because that's what the complainant, I'm going to call the complainant somebody who's bringing a concern, is going to pick up, hopefully, and understand where she needs to go. It's a roadmap. It's a roadmap, and it's a commitment by the board about what they will do if a concern comes to their attention. So there's some essential questions that should be in that complaints process. The first is, who does the complainant go to? Who does the complainant submit the complaint to? And when I say submit, I don't necessarily mean that it has to be in writing. The concern can be verbal, it can be going and sharing their story with somebody, but it needs to identify the who. And then if that person that is identified in the complaints process is the alleged abuser, the process needs to identify who the person goes to. So that's a best practice. You should always say, okay, if the complaint is about the secretary of the board, then you go to somebody else. So that should be identified. The complaints process should identify what happens if the alleged abuser, what happens to the alleged abuser when the complaint is being looked into. Are they automatically put on leave? How will the party's confidentiality be protected? We know that that's an obstacle for submitting complaints. People are afraid that their confidentiality won't be protected. So that should be outlined in the process as well. Is there a way to submit something anonymously? And how will the concern be investigated? Okay, so is the board committing to a full investigation every time? Or you want to leave some flexibility? There should be core commitments in the process, but also recognizing that every situation is going to differ. And so you want to leave some agility, some flexibility for the board to be able to respond with the guidance of some experts. I'm going to go to the last one because I'm running out of time, and I think this one's really important. And that is for communities to have a dedicated crisis response team. So this is a group of individuals who are appropriately trained to support and act when an incident arises. They will be trained around trauma-informed responses, around confidentiality. They will be familiar with the available resources in the community, and they certainly will be familiar with the complaints process. They should be there to support and to guide both parties, the person who's filing a complaint and the alleged respondent or abuser, through the process. So in identifying these tools, I think it's really important to stay grounded in what we know about our communities. Because if we set the bar too high, what we risk happening is that communities will dismiss them as being unrealistic and dismiss them as being unattainable. And so keeping that in mind, I want to say that the recommended response team doesn't have to be a group of professionals. They do not have to be a group of subject matter experts. I think they simply need to be individuals who commit to understanding the process and respecting confidentiality, are good empathetic listeners and communicators, have good judgment, and are open to learning more about how to be trauma-informed. And I really do believe that we have these individuals in our communities. They're not experts, they're not professionals, they're there, they're amongst us. But what we need to do is we need to empower them, and we need to train them, and we need to equip them to fulfill this role. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to discussing with those at our table. Thanks. Assalamu alaikum.